From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to the Blast Radius. I am your faithful correspondent and humble servant, and this is normally the part of the program where I do a very glib, very humorous, some might say occasionally funny, news roundup segment. But as I explained to my esteemed co-host yesterday, I don't feel quite right about opening the show that way this week, since the last time we convened, two of the greatest living Americans have passed from our midst. Thomas K. Mattingly II, Chicago, Illinois, Rear Admiral, U.S. Navy, Astronaut Group 5, Command Module Pilot, Apollo 16, Commander STS-4, Commander STS-51C. Passed away on 31 October at the age of 87. His death was announced by NASA on 5 November. And Frank F. Borman II, Billings, Montana, Colonel, U.S. Air Force, Astronaut Group 2, Commander, Gemini 7, Commander, Apollo 8. Passed away on 5 November at the age of 95. Only 27 men have flown to the moon this month already. We have lost 2 of them, and that is a big deal. That so little note has been taken of their passing should make us all deeply ashamed of ourselves as a nation, frankly. The men of Apollo are the greatest heroes we have. And how many of them remain alive after this week? 8. From Apollo 8, Jim Lovell, Bill Anders. Apollo 9, Dave Scott. Apollo 10, Tom Stafford. Apollo 11, Buzz Aldrin. Apollo 12, nobody. Apollo 13, Jim Lovell, Fred Hayes. Apollo 14, nobody. Apollo 15, Dave Scott. Apollo 16, Charlie Duke. Apollo 17, Senator Jack Schmitt. Charlie Duke was the youngest man to walk on the moon. He is currently 88 years old, which is to say, we are perilously close to all being able to say we live in a world where no living man has traveled outside of low Earth orbit. And for that, we should be ashamed of ourselves, not just as a nation, but as a species. Now, Ken Mattingly dying is a big deal. To the average American, they only know him as the Gary Sinise character from the Apollo 13 movie who got pulled from the flight in favor of Kevin Bacon 2 days before launch because the aforementioned Charlie Duke had exposed him to the measles. That average American probably doesn't know that Mattingly did wind up flying to the moon later on Apollo 16 with Charlie Duke, or that he's one of only 3 men to have performed a deep space EVA, or that he commanded the 4th space shuttle flight and the 15th space shuttle flight. In his post-NASA career, compared with some of his other colleagues, Mattingly led sort of an unusually private life. He had a few different jobs with defense contractors here in the San Diego area, but never showed all that much interest in being a public figure. I've watched just about every Apollo documentary there is, and I don't think I've ever seen more than 2 or 3 Ken Mattingly interviews, which is too bad because he comes off as entertaining and humble and good-natured, which by all accounts he was. Mattingly's astronaut group, Group 5, was the first one where test pilot was not one of the qualifying criteria. They knew they were going to need a lot more astronauts, and they decided the test pilot requirement was causing the talent pool to be a little bit more restricted than it needed to be, so they changed the flight requirement from test pilot to just 1,000 hours of sick time on jets, and the pool of qualified applicants swelled exponentially, which was the desired effect. A lot of guys who never considered becoming astronauts because their flying skills were never going to be test pilot level, well, suddenly they had the opportunity to apply for NASA, and Mattingly was one of those. So he applies, and somewhat to his own surprise, he gets selected, but NASA goes on such a spree of astronaut hiring at that point that even if you perform wonderfully, it's going to be some years before you get a seat on an actual flight. For Mattingly, he gets selected in 65 and doesn't get a primary flight crew assignment until Apollo 13, 5 years later, and then he gets bumped from that flight at the 11th hour over the whole measles thing. So it's another 2 full years and 7 years in total since being selected as an astronaut before the dude actually gets to fly as the CMP on Apollo 16 with John Young and Charlie Duke. It all worked out pretty well for Mattingly, though. Instead of nearly dying on an aborted mission and barely making it back alive, he got to go on a lunar flight that came off with probably fewer hitches than any of the other ones did. And you know what? Sometimes things in movies are true. When Mattingly got bumped from Apollo 13 48 hours before the launch, that was as great a professional devastation as a man can suffer. A man could be forgiven in that situation for brooding and engaging in a bit of self-pity. How did Mattingly react? He said, I got 48 hours to make sure Jack Sweigert's ready to fly this mission in my place. And that's what he did. So while the movie does overstate to some extent the role that Mattingly played on the ground in saving the day, it doesn't give him enough credit probably for how gracefully he handled the situation between his grounding and the launch. And let's call things what they are. If Jack Swigert had made any mistakes during that emergency, there is no successful recovery of Apollo 13. But he didn't make any mistakes. Why? Because Ken Mattingly had superhuman reserves of class and magnanimity. And as big a deal as Ken Mattingly dying is, Frank Borman dying is a really big deal. Frank Borman, in the judgment of this reporter, could have made a compelling case for the title of greatest living American. I think at a minimum, Frank Borman warrants flags being flown at half-staff, and I wouldn't be opposed to a lying in state in the Capitol Rotunda either. After all, if George Floyd warrants that sort of treatment, I would like to think Frank Borman does also. For no country has ever had a more capable, more faithful, more devoted servant than our country had in this man. Who was the first man to be the commander on his rookie flight? This guy. Who was one of the authors of history's first manned orbital rendezvous? This guy. Who was the commander of the first flight to the moon that they had to throw together in 4 months and came off without a hitch? This guy. Who was sitting in the Oval Office with President Nixon, helping him write his speech on the night Neil and Buzz walked on the moon? This guy. When Apollo 1 caught fire on the pad and Grissom, White, and Chaffee got burned alive, who did they appoint to lead the investigation? This guy. Oh, and if you want to feel really inadequate and unaccomplished, consider that Frank Borman did all that before his 41st birthday. In addition to being a fighter pilot, flight instructor, test pilot, and getting a master's degree in aeronautical engineering. A NASA psychiatrist once famously said that Frank Borman was the least complicated man he had ever met. In his office at NASA, and later when he was president of Eastern Airlines, he had a Tolstoy quote on his wall, and I suppose there's some irony in that. A devoted American Cold Warrior who takes his guiding principle from the works of a Russian author. And the quote is this: "The only legitimate happiness is honest hard work and the surmounting of obstacles." And as animated principles, a difficult one to argue with if it were more abided and applied with the single zeal that Frank Borman applied. Suspect that people of nations might prosper. And there was no artifice with this guy. He really did live according to that Tolstoy quote. He really did want nothing else but to help his team win because he's an American patriot. He went to West Point, became a fighter pilot because he wanted to help beat the Russians. He applied to become an astronaut because he wanted to help beat the Russians. And the astronaut corps provided an avenue for doing that didn't involve killing a bunch of people. So that was a nice side benefit. But then there was a lot of guilt that came later for Borman and others of the astronauts. And this was something that Gene Cernan spoke very powerfully about toward the end of his own life. Because in 68, 69, 70, when these guys were all flying to the moon and becoming the most famous celebrities in the world, the guys that they went to the academy with and to flight school with, they were flying combat missions over Vietnam, getting shot down, some of them killed, some captured. And Borman and Cernan, among others, they struggled to reconcile themselves with that. And the rejoinder, obviously, is, and they were told this by a lot of their fighter pilot friends, was to say, no, hell no. The amount of morale the country was getting from you guys flying to the moon and beating the damn Ruskies, that far outweighed anything you could have been doing if you were flying an F-4 over Da Nang. But even still, did they ever get over those feelings entirely? Of course they didn't, because how could you? Anybody with a functioning conscience would feel that way. And Frank Borman's death also, quite sadly, spells the end of one of America's great comedy teams. And that's the duo of Lovell and Borman. Listening to those two rip on each other, for me, it never got old. I would have been happy to see it continue forever. They flew with each other twice. And in fact, Borman never flew except with Lovell. And that they had a total of about 3 weeks of space flight time together between Gemini 7 and Apollo 8. So there was never any shortage of material for the comedy act. Much of it involved floating globules of vomit and diarrhea, which I'm sure Frank never got tired of hearing about. And they ripped on each other in a way that men only do when they have very deep bonds of affection with each other. So let's all spare a thought for Jim Lovell tonight, too, I think, because it must be a hell of a thing losing a guy who's been your best buddy for 50 years. But in the final analysis, this country of ours has a short and dwindling supply of real, bona fide, honest-to-God role models. The type of people you can point to and say to every little boy and every little girl, be like that person, emulate that person as much as possible, and you will lead a fulfilling, consequential life. In every interview he ever gave, Frank Borman said he never had any animating principle, except I want to use whatever talents I have to serve my country as well as I can. So, and how many kids do you think think that way here in the present day? I think many of us would probably prefer not to know the answer. And I guess there's not much left to say for the purposes of this segment, except Godspeed, Admiral Mattingly. Godspeed, Colonel Borman. A great nation salutes their service. We shall never see their like again. And with that, I send it over to your co-host and mine, the one and only Mr. Caucasian Sasquatch.